So, something interesting happening in the gaming space lately is that we're looking at games in a different way. So, we don't think of games as being one fixed thing anymore. Instead, they're always these ever changing, constantly updating, always patching concepts, which changes our relationship with the game. Because if we look at something like, I can't believe I'm using this example, Fortnite, every season the map changes, the design changes, they add content, they remove content. If you're someone who played Fortnite when it first came out and you want to go back and enjoy that, you can't. It doesn't exist anymore. Instead, you have something that's the same name by the same developers with some superficial similarities, but it's just a completely new experience. And thinking about how games are going nowadays, more developers are trying to do the same thing. They're trying to keep changing an existing game so that you keep playing it rather than making something that will stand the test of time on its own. So,
There's
with
a
that in mind,
really, really good example of that is No Man's Sky.
yeah, definitely,
No Man's
definitely.
Sky is a like it's coming out on Switch soon, right? I think it's early October. It's coming out on the Switch, and I haven't played No Man's Sky in a very long time. Um, but when I did last play it, I did not enjoy it anymore. I'm kind of one of the relatively few people that really enjoyed what they did with the original No Man's Sky, because a lot of the criticisms people had of that game were that it felt empty, and it was I mean it was
Had
largely
nothing to do,
that it was
had no
empty,
had
that
no
it
content.
yeah, and it felt lonely, and so on and so forth. It didn't have multiplayer, all those kinds of things. But for me, that was really a strong thematic core for the game, that you're out in space, you are alone, it is boring in a way, or in a in many ways. Basic survival is kind of the only objective, and there's a kind of there was a beauty about that I really appreciated. And I wrote I don't want to toot my own horn, but I did write a pretty good review about the qualities of the original No Man's Sky. Within a couple of updates, all of those qualities are gone, and it was replaced by something that people enjoyed. A lot of other people enjoyed, sure, but I didn't anymore. So I'm kind of looking forward to this Switch release to see how much further it has it has continued to go, and how little I'm probably going to enjoy it on that basis. But that is your point, that
Yeah, yeah,
because they keep updating this game, that original No Man's Sky that I loved, I can never play it again. It's gone.
yeah, yeah.
You can't choose to play an older version of No Man's Sky. What I liked about the game is just no longer there. And we were talking about we constantly talk about preservation of games, and all of that kind of stuff. For me, that's kind of the issue here, is that um, we're not preserving games, we're fixing them. um, but often in fixing them, we're fundamentally changing them.
Yeah, and even in the inverse, if the original release of the game was messy and buggy and actually kind of bad, and then they patch it up to make it good, there will still be some people who want the kind of bad version, right? Like the great example of that is World of Warcraft, where the classic server is super popular, even though I think most people would say the classic experience is just a worse game.
Yeah, yeah. Another example of that, I guess, is Deadly Premonition 2. I think they fixed the frame rate. And in doing
The
so,
frame rate is part of the aesthetic
well,
experience.
that was certainly the case for me. I thought that the dodgy frame rate was actually secretly something that Swery did on purpose,
Actually, I
because
remember you saying this, yeah, because you had this argument about how sometimes the frame rate is perfect when it needs to be, and sometimes it lags when it's meant to
yeah,
be.
I thought it was like a design choice. Maybe not, but he fixed it anyway, because he got enough blowback from players about it. And again, it's not the same experience anymore.
Yeah,
I,
that
I
frame rate, I really think it felt like you were drunk at times. Yeah, it felt interesting, even though it wasn't. I don't know if I 100% agree with you that was on purpose, but it definitely had its merits there.
I think
Yeah,
the
yeah.
problem we're running into is that we're a bunch of literary nerds who can find meaning out of anything, right? We can point at any specific design choice in a game and hypothesize what meaning or intention was behind it. Even if the developer themselves might not have had that intention, we can still make it meaningful. But suddenly that power is taken away from us when that changes from under our feet, right? If the game can constantly change, what can we continue to talk about? We can only criticize something that won't even exist in the future.
Well, that's kind of that is an interesting thing from, I guess, critical theory about video games and how we think about them and how we write about them and how we talk about them, that um we can't assume that what we're seeing is going to be permanent. And in some cases that's not an issue. Like, for example, I don't tend to write about game kind of crashing bugs in games. I don't tend to let that factor into my reviews because unless I've got a good reason to think the developers aren't going to fix it, because I generally assume that the
It'll
developers
be
are
a
going
day
to
one
fix it.
patch.
So there's no point talking about that in the context of a review that's going to be there in 2 years when the issue is not going to be there anymore. But it becomes a lot more sticky when I could be talking about anything to do with the game and it could change. A classic example of that. And for me, it kind of the catalyst moment where a lot of this stuff started to happen was the ending for Mass Effect 3. People who wrote about the original ending for Mass Effect 3 have written about something that no longer exists. Any version of Mass Effect 3 is now the fixed version, which changes the fundamentals about how that game ends. So if we can't talk about basic things like plot in games and assume that there's some kind of permanency about it, how do we talk about anything to do with the game unless it's a kind of a living conversation about that game ourselves, which as a critic makes things pretty difficult because I need to move on to the next game after I review one. I can't sit there and keep playing No Man's Sky every single day, every single update, and then writing a new review about it because there's just too many other games to play.
Yeah, there's a few different approaches that I've seen work. The first, and I keep talking about Fortnite because that's the one that everyone's writing about, is just to write about the ever-shifting nature of the game and to consider that the giving and taking away of components is just part of that aesthetic experience in the same way that the plot and graphics could be. So when people write about Fortnite, they don't write about specific elements. They write about the facts that these elements are always in flux. All the alternative is to just do an ongoing column, like with League of Legends coverage. It's just every week you write a new piece and you keep staying on top of all the changes and you just devote your life to it.
Yeah, those are approaches, I guess, but I don't think they lead to necessarily good criticism. And I don't mean that in a way that's kind of, being critical of the writers. I don't read this stuff, so I can't comment on their abilities as writers. I'm sure they're doing a great job for the community and whoever's playing these games. But for me, criticism itself has value as a permanent statement of record about something.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The two examples I've given are not lasting. They're very temporal in the same sense that the games they're talking about are always temporal. So
Well,
I definitely
I would
agree.
say that criticism is irrelevant now because games and how games are marketed, especially during the review stage and what are embargoes, you're not talking about, plot lines at various points anymore. Like they're either embargoed or they're like not what the intention of the, review from the publisher's point should be about. They are like, oh, you should be focusing on X, Y, and Z kind of thing. And that then becomes the narrative. And if you have a game which is constantly changing, like Fortnite, then you're constantly, even if you're not making another review, you're going to be constantly talking about these games. You're going to be constantly putting in either, new articles or you're going to be talking about it on podcasts. So the game is always in the narrative of the gaming space. So people are always saying, "Oh, have you heard about the new Fortnite update?" So people are like, "No, I haven't." And then so they're going out and they're going to play it. So that's all about trying to grab at people's attention rather than not necessarily having any critical thinking about the actual game. It's more about how long can we keep this game in the mind space of the consumers?
Yeah, and that's kind of the point, that if video games are meant to be an art form, and I find myself increasingly saying that with the if, because the direction this industry is going, I'm really starting to question the future of it as an art form. There was a point where it looked like it was going to be one of the great art forms, but I question that these days. But if video games are an art form, then having criticism, not reviews, criticism, having critical writing about video games is pretty important, because it is through the critical writing that we have the discussions about the art form, which is important in the development of the art form. And that has applied to every other art form out there, whether it's people writing, lengthy books about Shakespeare, or people writing essays about, the work of Degas or Van Gogh or whoever else. Or the early writings about cinema and how the directors actually did a lot of work in criticism that resulted in us having concepts like mise-en-scene and montages and things like that. The work of Eisenstein, the work of Eisenstein and various other kind of film theorists in the early days. That contribution via criticism was how we ended up with the art form turning into what it is now. We don't have that with games. And I don't think we're going to get that, because games are in this constant state of flux where there is nothing permanent to talk about with any video game anymore. And without having a permanency, then anything we write about the video game is itself going to be very limited.
I think that there is still a space in the market for permanent experiences, but I think the movement is definitely the most popular and the most played video games, and so by consequence, in 10 years, the most talked about video games are those ones that have lasted, that are constantly changing. And it's really weird for the art form, because it means that historically with gaming, the way we treat it is it's as if all of the historical paintings of the previous style have been locked away into a vault that's super hard to access, but they exist, right? And now with the constant patching and the live service experiences, it's as if we are setting fire to those old ones. I could go on YouTube and watch League of Legends, which I used to really enjoy, and realize that I can never ever play that game anymore. There's no possible way of accessing it, not just because it's locked away, but because it's been destroyed. So yeah, where are we? This is an existential threat for digitally downloaded.
And perhaps there will be some kind of two-speed games industry that will merge out of it. Perhaps we'll have the entertainment esports version or space of video games, where you have the likes of Fortnite, and for those spaces, the body of work is really around temporary design for consumption itself coverage. And then perhaps there will be that second speed, the indie, the art house, however you want to term it, side of the games industry, where we do have these conversations. And perhaps that's not going to be very popular.
That's my thought too, is that gaming has succeeded because the AAA space makes so much money that having the indies on the same store is already a benefit. Whereas if we have this split, then yeah, good luck to anyone making art. It's going to be the same as any other thing.
Well, it does raise the question about whether that space needs its own platforms. And we do have that in a sense that we've got Itch, for example, and Itch is an excellent platform that is specifically tailored only to the indie and the art house space. You can't really put a AAA game on Itch, and nobody does, because they deliberately restrict what you can put on that platform by I think the maximum size, there's a maximum file size of like a gigabyte. You can get permission to do something larger, but for that reason, you're not going to have an EA throw their 50 gigabyte FIFA on itch, even though they know it would sell because it's the only blockbuster thing on there. It's just not practical for them. They're not going to do it. Itch isn't going to allow it. So itch has become this platform for indie stuff. And perhaps the question then is, do we need devices that are kind of designed around the itch experience or the indie experience? And we have that as well because we've got Playdate now. Playdate's a really good, potentially pioneering example of where indie art house game devices could go.
Is
And
Playdate the Crank console?
yeah, it's the Crank console.
Yeah.
And it's proving
I
to be
think
really
that's
popular. It's like it's
that
this
to me is a
darling.
whole separate ephemeral concept in that no one it's not gonna have a huge market share. The people who enjoy it will like it, and none of those games are gonna appear anywhere again because who's gonna make another console for Crank?
Well, that's kind of the point that I'm getting at here. Perhaps we need to be we need to firstly accept that the indie space is never going to be of the size of the blockbuster space. But as long as it's sustainable, perhaps that's okay, if that makes sense. If the Playdate makes enough money that the company stays open and can continue to support the Playdate and perhaps make a Playdate 2 somewhere down the track. If they do that, then perhaps that's enough. And the Playdate's proving to be very popular with that space. You go on itch and there's new Playdate games being released on it constantly because they've been it's a natural fit for it. You're never going to see Playdate games released on Steam or whatever. But I just think that perhaps this is okay. And perhaps we need to, as a community, we need to be okay with the idea that the indie space and the blockbuster space have moved in different directions and don't necessarily need to cross over anymore.
Yeah.
Because then if we do that, then we can talk, we can engage with the indie space as a separate thing to video games. And we kind of had that discussion, I guess, a couple of years ago. There was that there were endless conversations about whether visual novels were video games, right? That's kind of died off because nobody really gives a crap anymore. But
yeah, it's a definitive yes now, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. But people had to become comfortable with the idea that visual novels existed and that they had an audience, and that audience wasn't as big as the Fortnite audience, but that was okay. And now we treat them as this separate thing, right? Walking simulators are another example. We have these kinds of genres which have always sat a little bit outside of where people have the perception of what video games are. And initially, there isn't a very high level of comfort with them. But as the general audience becomes, the players of those games become comfortable with their status, and the people who don't play those games kind of stop paying attention to them. They just become normalized. And I think that's where we need to get with the indie space, that we need to stop trying to compare the indie games to the blockbusters. We need to stop trying to imagine that these games can grow to become blockbusters. And we should instead kind of engage with them on their own terms.
In all of this, where do you see the mid-tier space then?
Oh, that's not going to exist.
It's not going to exist.
No, it's not going to exist for a couple of reasons. Firstly, the developers making those games are going to be acquired by big companies. Like, that is just going to happen. Embracer Group's going to buy 90% of them. The rest will go to Microsoft or Sony or Amazon, or they'll all be bought. Those companies are fundamentally up for sale because those companies they're 40, 50 people. They were made by people who were generally pretty creative and wanted to do something of their own. They wanted independence. They set out, they made a company, and that company has hit a point where it's fairly large and it becomes a target to be acquired. But at the same time, the people creating those companies are still business people. They want to make money. They're offered a chance to get out of the company with a big payday and millions of dollars. They're going to take it. Of course they're going to. So those companies just cease to exist in the sense that they just become absorbed into these really massive corporations. And when they become absorbed by them, the fundamental culture around those companies change. and the games that they produce will change. They might be the same kind of size and scale, but the idea of them being a double A game kind of goes with it, because they're not really anymore. They're backed by massive corporations. So that independent space that you're talking about with mid-tier games, I don't see there being a future for that. It'll be the big blockbusters, which will be 5 or 6 companies that are basically running everything and producing everything and consuming 90% of people's time and money. And then there'll be the tiny indie space where you've got developers of maybe 10 people, never going to be enough to be acquired. Certainly not of interest to the big companies. But with any luck, they find a sustainable audience.
It's like a horrifying microcosm of our economy.
I mean, it's pretty much the same everywhere, right? It's the film industry is the same. There's nobody creating mid-tier films anymore. In fact, that's been something that film writers seem to be finally catching up to and being quite frightened about it. They've realized finally that Disney's absorbing all the money in the film industry, and what's left is either the micro productions and publishers or Disney. So it's the same. I'm pretty sure it's the same with literature as well and music.
Yeah, I know music's definitely the same. Big labels versus indie guys.
Yeah, all of it's the same. The protections, it's really kind of the government protections over all this stuff. The protections that stop monopolies forming, or fundamental monopolies or duopolies, have kind of disappeared. So of course the big sharks are out there eating all the fish in the pond, and
the only people who are left are like too small to be worth eating.
Yeah, exactly. Too small to even be a snack to these guys. So that's just the end game for capitalism. And it sucks. But like I said, my great hope is that it's that indie space finds a way of being sustainable.
It's like a motto for our website. It's like, it sucks, now go play some indie games.
Yeah, pretty much. The good thing about games, I guess, is for now at least, the Japanese industry has a slightly different speed about it and is still large enough to produce interesting games. At the moment, it's too hard for these companies to acquire Japanese companies. So we haven't noticed too many big acquisitions of the Japanese guys because, for example, the one that people keep talking about, they want somebody to buy Konami because they have in their head that if somebody buys Konami, all of a sudden we'll get 20 Silent Hill games every year.
No one at Konami makes games anymore.
But if you were to buy Konami, you end up with a lot of stuff that doesn't really fit.
You end up with like pachinko machines and Yu-Gi-Oh.
Well, health clubs is the big one. Like Konami, a lot of Konami's money comes from gyms in Japan, and I actually splitting the company up from that point becomes very difficult as well. So if Microsoft was to be interested in buying a Japanese company, they buy a lot of stuff. They spend a lot of money on stuff that they don't want or need. It doesn't really fit their strategic vision. So that's why they don't. It's the same with pretty much all of those companies. If you were to buy Sega, for example, that's the other one. People are always like, yeah, Microsoft's going to buy Sega because then we'll have Yakuza on Game Pass, even though it's already there. But if you buy Sega, you get a toys business, which you're not going to necessarily want. I mean, Microsoft's not going to want to have to continue to produce Hatsune Miku figures into perpetuity because that's what Sega does. A big part of its business is those figures and the UFO catchers in arcades and stuff. All of this stuff just doesn't make sense to spend money on for a Microsoft. So they don't. So that's what's protecting the Japanese industry at the moment.
This is like very unconventional capitalism.
It's just a different way. Like Japanese companies, and it's not just in the video game industry, Japanese companies traditionally have a bunch
of stuff, right?
Yeah, they have a lot of different divisions. Like Sony, for example, of course, we all talk about PlayStation, but Sony has everything from camera business to TV business. They used to have a laptop business. They've got a lot of different businesses. I think they even have a chemicals business. So the way that Japanese companies are organized is you grow by finding new product segments to enter into. Whereas in America or the West, you grow by vertical. You grow by
you make your
getting,
one thing bigger.
you grow by doing more and more and more of the stuff that you're already doing, and dominating that kind of product segment. So it kind of worked out nicely for the Japanese industry in the sense that it does protect them a bit. It's a very inefficient way of doing business, which means that the Japanese industry or Japanese companies do struggle a bit with competing globally, but it does protect them a little bit from overseas acquisition.
And I guess we'll also see a lot of development coming from other spaces as well. Once Europe and America turns into these big companies, we'll see more games out of Australia and East Asia and Latin America and all those places as well.
I'm really looking forward to seeing what China does. I mean, China's obviously got very big companies as well. Tencent.
China's got Tencent, yeah.
Yeah.
It's just like a whole different beast.
Which is just a mammoth of a company. But also, we're just starting to see now that Chinese developers do some really interesting things with very small scale.
Is Sword and Fairy affiliated with Tencent in any way?
No, and that's Taiwanese company, so we should be careful.
Oh,
about.
okay, that's fine. Yeah, I should be careful.
We should be very clear about that. I should be more clear about it. I'm looking forward to seeing what comes out of both China and Taiwan, because both of those emerging industries are doing some very interesting things. But out of China, you've had stuff like Banner of the Maid, which was a really nice little tactics RPG that was based on the Napoleonic era, which was really fun. They did the Bright Memory first-person shooter. That was a one-person team out of Shanghai. Created a really neat little first-person shooter that even I enjoyed.
That was pretty good.
And then, of course, Genshin Impact came out of nowhere to become the massive thing that it is.
That's huge.
So, yeah, the Chinese industry is really interesting. Taiwanese industry has Sword and Fairy, and also Xuan Wan Sword. They both come from the same company, actually. Soft Star, I want to say that's their name. So they've also got Red Lantern. Well, they did.
I don't know if
Red Candle. I don't know if they're still around.
So good. They were so good.
But that's kind of the indie stuff that's coming out of those countries, which is really fascinating. And like you say, also there's some really interesting stuff coming out of Indonesia and Thailand, and these countries will have quite interesting games industries. I think India as well. A couple of games have come out of India in recent years, which have been fascinating.
And in their own way, each of these companies will be resistant to corporate takeover.
Yes. I mean, and amongst other things, most of them are too small to bother, which is the other good thing. When you're only a team of 10 people, you don't add that much to the companies that have got like 1 million people worldwide. And unless you've got a lot of really strong IP, the likes of Embracer Group aren't that interested in you either. So being indie does insulate you from being acquired.
I guess it's like a neutral change, right? It's neither a good or a bad thing. It's like this is what's going to happen kind of thing.
I think it's really bad what is happening at the top end of the games industry. And I've been quite vocal about that. I think the acquisitions are terrible. I think the consolidation in the industry is terrible. I think we're getting worse and worse ideas, quality ideas and games out of that space. But once you become comfortable with the fact that that change is happening and you start looking elsewhere for games, then there is a lot of good stuff happening, and you've just got to be open, I guess, to change. That you don't need to be playing Assassin's Creeds or AAA games anymore. You don't need to have those things. You can have a good time by loading up each week and downloading a bunch of quirky stuff and playing those.